Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar. I'd like to thank Angela and the Ontario Clean Air Alliance for hosting the event this evening. The Ontario Clean Air Alliance is a small but mighty community organization with a great deal of expertise and commitment to moving Ontario onto a 100% renewable energy path. My name is Laura Tanguay, and I am a Ph.D. candidate at York University, where I research mechanisms and discrepancies of consent for nuclear waste siting in Ontario. For those of you tuning in after the live event, we are gathering from across Canada this evening. It's Wednesday, October 18th. We have panelists and guests tonight from coast to coast to coast on the traditional and treaty territories of many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. I personally am located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. I've got some resources to share for those to engage in additional learning, including whos.land. You can look at the calls to action, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Canada's UNDRIP Act, the Yellowhead Institute is a great resource, and the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. Given the content that we will be discussing today and the historical, contemporary, and future ways that the nuclear fuel chain disproportionately burdens Indigenous communities, I encourage you to critically engage in this content and consider how Indigenous governance, laws, cultures, and traditions are impacted and influence nuclear activities in the province. This evening, we have three amazing and well-informed panelists to cover the context of Ontario's investment in new nuclear. Is nuclear the golden ticket to solving the climate crisis, or is the government being strong-armed by technocrats, or somewhere in between? I'll introduce each speaker before they present, and we will reserve discussion and Q&A until all panelists have presented. Tonight, we are in live webinar format, meaning that questions will be taken in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. And for the sake and organization and of running this event smoothly, we won't take questions with the raise hand function or with mics on. So please do use the Q&A and we will get your questions answered. So first, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mark Winfield. Mark is professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University and co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative. Mark has published articles, book chapters, and reports on a wide range of climate change, environment, and energy law and policy topics. He is the author of Blue-Green Province, The Environment and Political Economy of Ontario, published by UBC Press. And he is co-editing Sustainable Energy Transitions for Canada, also published by UBC Press in November. So take it away, Mark.
Thanks, Laura. And I'm happy also to be joining you from the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and under the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. I'm going to do a screen share here, and hopefully that is working for everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about context and the specific situation we are here in Ontario at the moment, and then where that may lead us in the future. Ontario is kind of an interesting place to look at from an electricity perspective. We've got all kinds of interesting debates embedded here between hard versus soft paths, very centralized versus more decentralized pathways, tensions between markets and planning, although in fact where we're ending up is neither at the moment. And central to tonight's discussion is around the future roles of different energy technologies, nuclear, natural gas, renewables, distributed resources, demand side activities, and relationships with other provinces. And behind this, there's a conversation about the relationship between energy, the economy, the environment, and climate change. It's helpful to have some historical context because, in fact, the past comes back to haunt us in this story in all kinds of interesting ways. For the first 90 years, the system was dominated by the Ontario Hydroelectric Commission, or latterly Ontario Hydro. And a central part of this story is that Ontario Hydro effectively bankrupted itself by overbuilding supply. It worked in what was termed a supply planning paradigm, essentially built far more than was needed, particularly through its nuclear construction program, ended up $38 billion in debt, And part of the analysis that went on at the time was this partially because there was no effective regulatory oversight or control over what Ontario Hydro was doing. As we'll see, there are some rarely quite significant echoes of the past, which are coming back to haunt us quite significantly in the present. One of the key successors of Ontario Hydro, in fact, the key successor in many ways, is Ontario Power Generation, which initially inherited Ontario Hydro's nuclear, coal, and hydro assets. It now is also, although it doesn't run coal plants anymore, it's now a very significant gas-fired generation operator. And as things are playing out, OPG now seems to control about the same portion of electricity generation in Ontario as Ontario Hydro did back 30 years ago. So we're sort of the past keeps coming back in interesting ways. A little bit of background on the system. Up until 1960, Ontario's electricity system was essentially 100% hydroelectric. It's been described as the perfect renewable energy system. Demand did begin to outstrip the supply of readily available hydro sites at that point. And from there, Ontario embarked on this massive nuclear construction program between the 1960s and the 1990s. As you'd hear, by the mid-90s, the system was 60% nuclear in terms of energy output. There were some hiccups there, particularly in the late 90s, when a significant portion of the nuclear fleet had to be taken offline for a combination of technical and operating issues, and we ramped up coal-fired electricity instead, which, among other things, spawned the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, the sponsor of this event. That set in motion ultimately policy decisions to phase out coal, and you can see the transition here between 2003 and 2014, when coal was 25%, and by 2014 it was zero. And we also start to see this growth in non-hydro renewables, which had been completely absent from the system up to that point. Where we stand now, from a standing start of zero, we have installed now over 5,000 megawatts of wind and over 2,500 megawatts of solar in a window that roughly stretched from about 2007 to 2018. In terms of, this is the distribution connected component, which is quite significant for solar. In terms of energy output, the system is about 60% nuclear at this stage, but we also now are at about 10% non-hydro renewables. The problem, as we'll see, is that the growth that was happening in that space has now come to an almost complete halt. The last actual sort of plan we had in Ontario for electricity dates from 2017. It was a legacy of the Wind government, actually. And at that stage, they had committed to the refurbishment of the Darlington and Bruce facilities, a life extension, as they call it, on the Pickering B facility, which is 4 reactors, which really was supposed to have closed in 2018. There was quite a strong conservation strategy, but there had been a complete abandonment of any further significant development of renewables. And crucially, for the purposes tonight, the Wind government had also eliminated any planning structure. There had been requirements that there be some sort of system plan, that be reviewed by the Ontario Energy Board. Those requirements were eliminated through Bill 135 in 2015. So effectively, the province was left with no planning framework. Essentially, the system is run on the basis of political directives. That becomes even more apparent as, of course, Mr. Ford arrives in 2018. He has a well-known allergy to renewable energy projects. One of the first things he did was to cancel the last 750 projects which had been left over from the Green Energy Act era, repealed the Green Energy Act, also terminated the, up to that point, quite successful conservation strategy on the grounds it was actually being too successful, terminated the province's climate change action plan, and did get rid of also the very last vestiges of any kind of planning framework, that there had been a requirement there at least be some sort of electricity energy plan issued every 3 years. That went as well. So we were effectively left in something of a vacuum, but into that vacuum began to emerge a kind of pathway. I think it's sort of, certain actors have, shall we say, filled the vacuum. And in its early stages, what began to emerge was clearly a continuation of the Darlington and Bruce refurbishments, proposals for new build reactors at Darlington, initially 1, although that now has grown to 4, and also efforts to continue the Pickering B refurbishment. And we're also seeing a very dramatic ramp up of the role of gas-fired generation. This is in part a corollary to the refurbishments that as those plants go offline, in the short term, the generating requirements are being made up through running the gas plants that were built in the early 2000s more intensively, and we're also adding capacity on gas, with the implication that the greenhouse gas emissions from the sector are also on track to rise by a factor of about 8 by 2040 relative to the low we hit around 2017. The pathway has sort of been formalized. This was effectively the response to the Clean Air Alliance's campaign around phasing out gas-fired generation in the interest of decarbonization. And the independent electricity system operator, which isn't actually that independent, came up with a sort of proposal called Pathways to Decarbonization, which anticipates a doubling of demand by 2050 as a result of electrification, but then proposes to respond to that with a fairly massive construction program, especially around nuclear, at a cost of approximately $400 billion. To put some context in that, the total economic activity in the electricity sector in Ontario each year is somewhere less than $20 billion a year. So it would be more capital expenditure than the total activity in the sector each year. What is being operationalized at this stage and is the ongoing refurbishment at Darlington, and now proposals to add 4 300 megawatt new reactors, effectively at Darlington B, an ongoing refurbishment at the Bruce facility of 6 reactors, and now a proposal to add 4 of unknown type or scale, but these will probably be large units, to proceed with the Pickering B refurbishment. As I mentioned, the ramping up of existing gas and also the addition of new gas-fired capacity, emphasizing there is no plan here, and there is no review process. There is nowhere any of this has to go in Ontario where questions are asked about, does this make sense as a pathway to decarbonization, or does this make economic sense? This is essentially an unregulated trajectory that is subject to no meaningful oversight or review. A situation that kind of reminds us of the situation Ontario Hydro operated in the 1960s and 70s, and we know how that ended. No movement really on much else, certainly no movement on renewables. We've seen a little bit of movement on grid scale storage, but the rationale for that is unclear given we're not doing anything on renewables. There are some hints at a feeble restart on conservation demand management. Very interesting work being done behind the scenes on distributed resources is things like wiring rooftop solar and parked electric vehicles and other things into microgrids, but no actual significant development there, and some minor movement around Quebec. The pathway the province is on presents some very, very significant challenges. All of the new builds are either unproven, none exist in the world in terms of the reactor technology, or in the case of Bruce, the technology is simply unknown. These won't be CANDUs. These will not be the types of reactors we've had in Ontario, or indeed types we've ever seen in Canada before. The costs are essentially unknown, but we know out of the sort of alleged nuclear renaissance that happened in the early 2000s, that the industry continues to suffer from a record of severe delay and severe cost overruns. When we look at the projects in France and Finland, in the United States, the handful that did actually emerge, all of them look like disasters from an economic perspective. It's not clear who's going to finance this. The private sector doesn't like to touch nuclear with the 50 billion foot pole. It's very, very interesting that the only actual investor in the new builds so far is the Federal Infrastructure Bank, which is essentially the federal government, which has given OPG $1 billion. There are questions around waste fuel management. Ralph Torie will talk about the uncertainties around the demand projections, and indeed the nature of the pathways to decarbonization that may be realized, especially given the province has absolutely no framework whatsoever for decarbonization. And indeed, the loads that we would anticipate from an electrification pathway are increasingly dynamic, the types of loads that nuclear is notably bad at dealing with. And we also need to keep in mind the context that while nuclear technologies have not really changed that much, we've been in a period of enormous technological development and maturation around the alternatives, particularly renewables, storage, broadly what we term smart grids, and then their integration into distributed resources and microgrids. In these areas, we are seeing costs falling dramatically, technological performance improving, and our ability to manage these more distributed resources improving dramatically. Ontario, interestingly, is also probably more than anywhere else in Canada, a place where considerable thinking and quite serious modeling has been going on about what pathways to decarbonization might actually look like. Many of these point potentially in the direction that are certainly not as nuclear heavy as what the province is proposing. The problem here is that the province refuses to listen to any of these alternatives, and there is no forum or no structure within which the province is required to answer questions about, well, why does its pathway make sense and the ones being proposed by people like the Atmospheric Fund or the David Suzuki Foundation or others don't. What we've been left with really is a vacuum and a kind of perfect window for the incumbents, in the sense that we have no planning framework, no regulatory oversight of any meaningful form whatsoever, a government that is fond of building big things and is not particularly noted for its strengths in critical thinking. And the incumbents, particularly Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power, have very much taken advantage of this situation and are moving to lock in their preferred pathways before anybody can start to ask too many complicated questions. It is a case study in the success of incumbency, but whether or not where this is taking us makes any sense economically or from a decarbonization perspective, I think, to say nothing of a wider sustainability perspective, is to put it mildly, an open question, but a question where we don't have anywhere to ask it. Thank you. And I'll stop the screen share too. There we go.
Thank you so much, Mark. Always so insightful and maybe giving us some insights into the title of the webinar. Next, I'd like to introduce MV Ramana, who is the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security and professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. He is the author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, published by Penguin Books in 2012, and also a forthcoming book explaining why nuclear power is not a solution to climate change, being published by Verso Books. Ramana is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials and the Canadian Pugwash Group, and the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, and the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Ramana, and whenever you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you all. Thank you for this invitation. I'm joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. It's my privilege to be living here and working here. I'm going to sort of move a little bit away from the focus on Ontario to talk more globally about nuclear energy, to give you some sense of what's happening on that front. So I'll sort of, the story about nuclear energy around the world is probably best seen in a long-term perspective. And if you look at the global nuclear reactor fleet, the best days of construction of new nuclear plants was over about 3 decades, more than 3 decades ago. Every year, this plot here from the World Nuclear Industry Status Report plots the number of reactors that were connected to the grid starting in 1954 all the way till the end of last year. And what we see is that the world's reactors were mostly built in 2 big waves, one in the 1970s, which was mostly in North America, and one in the 1980s, which was mostly in Western Europe. And since 1985, the 1984 and 85 were the 2 years when there was a maximum number of reactors that were constructed, a little bit over 30 reactors each of those years. After that, the rate of reactors being connected to the grid fell dramatically. There are many years since then when more reactors have been shut down. And the result of this slow construction rate, as well as reactors being shut down, is that the global capacity of nuclear power around the world has been more or less constant. It's sort of gone up a little bit because many of the older reactors have been refurbished to try and produce more power out of the same. But it's not increasing very fast. And the consequent result is that the share of electricity around the world in the world's electricity grids that are supplied by nuclear plants has declined dramatically. It was around 17.6%. That was the highest it ever was in the mid-1990s. And the last year's number was just barely over 9%. And from all sort of indicators, it looks like it's going to be falling more in the future. In contrast, renewables, modern renewables, that's not including large hydro dams, has been increasing quite rapidly compared to nuclear. And it reached 14.2% last year. So why is this? The simplest reason to explain this is that nuclear power is just not economically competitive. And that in turn is because reactors cost too much to build. One can think of a nuclear reactor as essentially just a very complicated way to boil water. You're using a very hazardous process to boil this water, and it is never going to be cheap. The idea that you can ever have a cheap reactor is just impossible simply because of the complexity of the technology. And whereas in contrast, some of the other technologies, and Mark sort of mentioned how renewables have been falling, and this picture here shows the estimates made by this company in Wall Street called Lazard that looks at the US market. The US is probably the largest energy market other than China, for which we have very little data. This calculates the levelized cost of energy, which is a metric that is used to estimate the cost of energy production. And what it shows is that the nuclear power is the most expensive way. New nuclear power plants are the most expensive way to generate power in the United States. It's around $160 to $170 per megawatt hour, whereas solar and wind are now coming out in the $30 to $40 range. And that's sort of a dramatic change in the last decade. And so it's natural that new nuclear plants are not going to be constructed. But for many years, the story from the nuclear industry has been, we know nuclear plants are expensive to construct, but once they are constructed, they are relatively cheap to operate because they don't require a lot of uranium. And so the fueling costs are low. But this story started becoming unstuck in the last decade when a number of reactors were shut down because of high operational costs and the fact that alternatives are cheaper. So, and usually the reasons have to do with either not being able to sell their power on electricity markets, or because there is some major repair work that has to be done because some piece of equipment has failed, and then the utility simply decides it's not worth refurbishing or replacing that plant, and then comparing it with the alternative. So one of the last ones that did that was in Iowa, when the only nuclear plant was shut down following some damage to it because of a storm. And the utility that operated the plant did calculations that showed that they would save about $300 million per year just replacing the energy from the Duane Arnold plant, nuclear plant that was shut down with wind energy. So that's the story. And new nuclear power, as Mark mentioned, has not come out at the kind of cost that was expected. The Vogtle plant in Georgia has ended up costing nearly $35 billion, which is up from an estimate of $14 billion when construction started around a decade ago. And in turn, that $14 billion was about 3 times the cost estimates that were made by Westinghouse company, the company that designed the AP1000 reactor, which was sort of stated in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, the period when there was all the talk about a nuclear renaissance. And at that time, Westinghouse said, we have learned our lesson. We know there's a long history of cost and time overruns, but now we know how to do this better. And they estimated costs of about $5 billion, and that didn't happen. And it fell very much in line with the historical average, where one study found that 97% of all nuclear projects had exceeded the budget. The other point I want to sort of mention is that in as much as this is talking about climate change, there's also a very important parameter, which is how long it will take for any savings or any reductions in emissions from nuclear power. The average construction time for a nuclear plant is roughly about 10 years. And some plants can be significantly longer. 20 years, 25 years is not unusual. And so if, let's say, British Columbia, where I live, were to decide that they want to build a nuclear plant, it will take them 10 years to build the plant, but it will probably take them another 5 to 10 years before that to get the environmental permits, to find a community that is willing to host one of these plants, and most importantly, raise the tens of billions of dollars that it requires to construct this plant. So it's not going to be a quick process. All of the things that we've been told about how we have learned from new technology using modular construction, so on, just did not work out in the case of the Vogtle plant. The so-called sort of nuclear renaissance in both the United States and in the UK talked about building large numbers of reactors by 2020, and that just didn't happen. The only reactors that have come online in either the United States or the UK have been the Vogtle plants. And a whole bunch of them that were proposed in the United States, there were sort of 30 reactors were ordered and 15 were expected to come online before 2021. None of that happened. And so the point is that if you want to think about the climate, we must not just about the fact that nuclear plants don't involve burning fossil fuels at the site of generation, but we should also think about how much it costs and how long it takes. And by those counts, I think nuclear just doesn't work very well. Okay, so one other answer to this, which you might hear, is that all of these problems will go away if you build small modular reactors. And there's a lot of what people in the regulatory world called happy talk, that this is what vendors are going to come and say. And so they will say, for example, that the new small modular reactor designs are simple, that they are safe, that they are more proliferation resistant, that they are going to be cheap, and they will change the way you're going to be building reactors and so on and so forth. And also that, they are going to produce less waste. Now, will this all actually happen? And the simple answer is that for any of these properties to be realized, for example, if you want to reduce the amount of waste that a reactor produces, it has to be translated into a technical requirement on the design. And when you try to compare what the different requirements are, you will quickly realize that all of these properties, the reduction in the waste, the safer or the lower risk of accidents, the lower risk of proliferation and production of fissile material, all of that just cannot happen in the same design. And so if you're going to make one problem less, or you're going to ameliorate one problem, you're going to exacerbate other problems. In particular, the fact that you're talking about small reactors, small does not mean small physically. They're not even small when you compare them to the amount of power that is produced by, let's say, a solar project. But these are small only in relation to large nuclear plants. But still, the reason that Ontario and various other places went to large reactors is that they were trying to gain on what are called economies of scale and lower their costs. And therefore, conversely, if you're going to go to small nuclear reactors, you're going to become more expensive on a per unit of electricity generation or electricity production. And they will also produce more spent fuel and waste simply because they're going to be less efficient. And the idea that somehow by building large numbers of them, learning might help lower costs is being disproved in the nuclear industry. Nuclear industry is one example where costs have actually increased over time. The graph here shows the cost increases in the United States and France, the countries with the most number of nuclear plants. And even if there is going to be, optimistically speaking, if there's going to be learning, you're going to have to build a very large number of what one might call loss leaders before you can actually even break even with large nuclear power, which itself is not economical. So small modular reactors are simply not going to solve the economic problems of nuclear power. Just one more thing which I'd say about small reactors. Again, as I mentioned, small reactors aren't new. The United States, for example, built a whole bunch of them before the in the 1950s and 1960s, and almost all of them were shut down early. The best example I can think of is one called Elk River, which was meant to be the one that allows for rural municipal cooperatives to build nuclear plants. And when that was built, it cost about 250% over the initial things. And within 4 years, there was serious repairs that had to be done that the utility just decided to shut it down because they thought that it was just not worth, it was not making economical sense for them. And that history is being reflected in more recent designs as well. So those small modular reactor designs, which have had some cost estimates associated with them, you will see they are all much more expensive than the cost of even large nuclear plants, let alone solar and wind, which are far, far cheaper at this point. And the best example I would say is that of NuScale down in the United States, which is now estimated at around 250% of the cost of the Vogtle plant on a per kilowatt or per megawatt basis when Vogel's construction started. And of course, that cost ballooned once the construction started, and there's no reason to expect that NuScale is not going to do the same. There are also long time delays. Whoops, I'm sorry. What happened there? Anyway, so I'm just going to say there are long time delays associated with all of these designs that we are not going to see SMRs being deployed anytime soon. I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That gave us a lot to think about, and I think gonna add a lot for discussion following our third and final presentation by panelist Ralph Torie. Ralph is an internationally recognized analyst and communicator in the field of energy and environmental systems. Ralph is currently Director of Research at Corporate Knights, where he recently produced an investment strategy for green economic transition for Canada. His expertise in Ontario's energy system dates to his involvement with the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning in 1976. He authored the first soft energy path study for Ontario and the first low carbon pathway analysis for Canada. So ready when you are, Ralph. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Ramana and Mark, for your presentations. I learned, as I always do, new things. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Did that work? Good, I hope. I want to divide my time more or less in two. I want to first talk about whether nuclear power has a role over the long term in a sustainable energy future for Ontario. And in the second half of my remarks, I want to zero in on whether it can make a meaningful or any contribution to an effective emergency response to climate change over the next 10 years. The answer to that second part has already been put forward in a couple of different ways, but I'll return to it. But on this first question, I think it's important with all of the focus on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions to remind ourselves that the concept of a sustainable human civilization with a sustainable energy system is much broader than only achieving a balance in the carbon cycle, which is what the climate change issue is all about. And in addressing the question, is there a role for nuclear power in such a sustainable future? Of course, one has to first ask oneself, well, what would a sustainable energy system look like? And I thought about this in getting ready for it tonight, and I really couldn't think of any great examples that we've been responsible for. But when I thought about the ecosphere more generally, and the principles which seem to govern the way that that system operates and the way that energy flows through and gets applied in that system, I began to identify what for me are some of the attributes that we need to try and achieve in our human technology and in our human system if we are going to emulate the one example that I can bring to mind of where a sustainable energy system has been achieved, which is in our planetary ecosphere. And so I thought about the renewable energy and the diversity and the circularity and the beauty and the balance and the efficiency and the interconnectedness of that system. And I came up with a short bullet list, and I know I'm not an expert on this, and I know Mark Winfield has written peer-reviewed papers on this subject, but here's a few of the things that I would be looking for in a sustainable energy system. Does it run on renewable energy? Is it efficient, not only in the narrow sense of not wasting energy outright, but does it meet needs by matching the scale and the quality of the energy being used to the end use need that's being satisfied? It wouldn't generate greenhouse gas emissions, at least not on a net basis. It would be characterized by circular flow of materials. It wouldn't generate toxic waste or radioactive waste. In fact, there really isn't any waste in the ecosphere system. It's an economic concept that doesn't really have any meaning in ecology. It would be resilient and diverse. When there were failures, there isn't actually, it's interesting, in the ecosphere, there aren't really failures in the way that humans tend to define that word, but when failures or when death or other negative things happen to individual organisms, they don't happen in a way that threatens the whole system. The failures themselves tend to be safe, even productive when you think about it. The example of the nurse log that I had up briefly a moment ago being a great example of that. And certainly it wouldn't be a system that would generate what's called ecocidal risk. That is, it wouldn't even admit the possibility of things happening that could put the ability of the ecosphere itself to support life at risk. And finally, and this is perhaps the more subjective than the previous bullets on my list, and you can make your own, it would reinforce cultural values. I think for us, that means that you're looking for an energy system that supports and reinforces equity and accessibility, self-determination, community autonomy, and what Ivan Illich would call conviviality, technologies which, while we may not understand them, at least don't threaten us. So with that list in mind, I then turned back to the question, is nuclear power aligned with such a future? Does it emit greenhouse gas emissions? Very, very few. I mean, it's a very low emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, so I give them that point. A check mark there. Is it a renewable? And obviously, by the way, no individual technology can be said to be sustainable or not sustainable. Sustainability is a system attribute, but we can talk about whether technologies are aligned with or compatible with a sustainable system, and that's the spirit in which this particular slide is intended to be taken. Does nuclear power run on renewable energy? Well, no, clearly not. I don't think there's any need for an explanation of the score on that point. Is it efficient? And I'm speaking now as a physicist. It is so incredibly inefficient that it boggles the mind. You know that for every unit of electricity that a CANDU power plant puts onto the grid, it dumps 2 units of useless waste heat into the Great Lakes. It's a prodigious amount of wasted heat, and there's so much of it in such a small spot that it's not possible that you could ever utilize more than a tiny fraction of it in an effective way. The Carnot cycle, as Ramana mentioned earlier, the boiling water to raise steam, to turn a turbine, to make electricity. We'll look back on it at some point in history as a low point in human innovation, I think. So efficient? Absolutely not. Is it circular? Well, of course not. We've already talked about the once-through cooling that characterizes nuclear power. It's once through fuel. The fuel goes through, it becomes waste in the process of being irradiated, waste that needs to be managed, cooled for a number of years. It's so hot and continuing to generate new heat. And then for decades and even centuries after that, it will have to be safely stored, probably monitored to prevent it's re-entering the atmosphere or the ecosphere, where it would present a health hazard to life. Does it fail safely? Well, obviously not. A lot of the effort and a lot of the expense of building nuclear power reactors goes into trying to find ways to make them safe in the event of accidents, because accidents at nuclear power plants are inherently dangerous accidents. Anytime you have concentrations of highly radioactive material, particularly in the presence of high temperatures and pressures, you have an inherently dangerous situation, which if it fails, will not fail safely. We therefore have no choice if we build these things but to rely on what we call fail-safe engineering, that is, remedial technologies that will intervene quickly enough, hopefully, and be effective enough in their barriers to prevent exposure of the public or the workers at the plant to dangerous levels of radioactivity. Is it resilient? Well, that's an interesting question. For me, the answer to that would also have to be a no. Particularly the way that we do it here in Ontario, where we put so many of these reactors on a single site. As we've seen from Chernobyl to 3 Mile Island to Fukushima, when you have an accident at one of these plants, the whole site will have to be shut down, potentially permanently. And this is really the opposite of how you would build a system if you were trying to achieve resilience. And it's ironic that even with the onset of these smaller reactors that the industry here in Ontario, or at least the General Electric Company wants to build here in Ontario, offered the possibility of maybe spreading around the risk. They've chosen instead to put them on sites that already have an exorbitant amount of concentrated radioactivity and nuclear power production going on. So no, not resilient. Is it diverse? Again, these power reactors are among the clumsiest, most sluggish, and least flexible contributors to our electricity supply. They do not like to go up and down in power. They do not follow the load effectively. They are the opposite of, I think, what any ecologist would consider to be compatible with diversity in the system. I've already referred to the ecocidal risk that they represent. There's also a geopolitical risk with this technology, which Ramana has made reference to. It's one which we've got experience with in this country, with the CANDU being a particularly effective plutonium producer. And now with the new reactor at Darlington, it's proposed that Canada start to build reactors using highly enriched uranium, moving away from pressurized water to boiling water. So definitely increasing the vulnerability of the nuclear fuel cycle in this country to cross over geopolitical risks. Is it aligned with cultural values? I'm going to put a question mark here because, again, this is perhaps the most subjective of the criteria that I've put forward. But I did Google the question, or Google the phrase Ontario nuclear power plants and security in preparing for tonight, just to see what sort of images would come up. And, for me, it's interesting. This is the first one that came up. No, this is not a bunch of overgrown children dressed up for Halloween. This is, the caption says, Bruce Power's award-winning nuclear response team. This is, part of the day shift up at the Bruce. And as you continue to explore the connections between nuclear power and the type of cultural values and the type of security and control that's required to maintain safety and to keep it insulated from some of these ecocidal and geopolitical risks that it fundamentally presents, for me, it's not compatible with the types of values that I would like to think represent Ontario and Canadian culture. And it's no surprise to me, as a quick perusal of Michael Snyder's World Nuclear Industry Report will show you, that nearly all of the nuclear construction activity in recent years has been either in China or Russian-built and designed reactors in Russian satellite countries, two countries with very high levels of centralized control and restricted individual freedoms, very compatible with the nuclear option. So for me, the answer to this first question then is a no. Maybe it's not for you, but do think about it, because it seems to me that the second question, which is there a role for new nuclear power right now in Ontario? And is it consistent with an effective emergency response to climate change? How you might answer that question is going to be influenced by whether you think there's a long-term role for nuclear in a sustainable Ontario. If you don't, if you agree with me that it doesn't have a long-term role, you might still answer yes to this question. You might still say, in spite of that, we have no choice but to build them now for the climate change response purpose, I suppose, since they don't really seem to have anything else going for them in our checklist. Or if you answered yes, nuclear power is compatible with a sustainable future. If you disagree with me and come to the opposite conclusion, you might still answer no to the question of whether this is a good time for Ontario to be expanding our dependence on nuclear power. A few observations then on the second question that I wanted to put in front of you. And one of the beauties of a panel like this is one doesn't feel a responsibility to address every aspect of the question. But, claims that this new reactor at Darlington, and by the way, I can't bring myself to call them small or modular. There's nothing modular about it. And as for small, it's 300 megawatts, this reactor. It's 12 stories high. It has a footprint that's 1.5 football fields long and a football field wide. And that's just for one. I don't get how that gets to be called small. And it's a prototype, which is about the opposite of modular as you can get. But claims that this in any way is going to help us in the 2020s are just not credible. It's been 30 years since the last nuclear plant was finished in this province. 30 years, a generation. People that worked on it are retiring. It took them about 8 years per reactor to build that last plant. That was the Darlington plant. Another interesting thing about the historical pattern is that the B plants took longer than the A plants. And you would think, in the context of modularity, that when you twin a plant, whether it's Pickering B to Pickering A or Bruce B to Bruce A, the things that you learned building the first set would allow you to finish the second set quicker. But as you can see by looking at the pair of blue bars or the pair of gray bars, just the opposite was the historical case. We ended up taking more time to build the second set than the first set. And the long-term trend, when you look at it, has actually been increasing amounts of time to build these reactors. And this is just the time from when construction starts. And as Ramana pointed out before that, there can be a very multi-year period of planning and license applications and approvals and so on that goes on. So no, these will not be here in the 2030s. Nuclear power, new nuclear power cannot contribute to climate mitigation in the 2020s, not in this province, and I don't think anywhere. The GE Hitachi 300 megawatt reactor, for which site preparation is underway at Darling. It's a prototype. As Mark already pointed out, it uses a very different technology from CANDU. It's never been licensed here or anywhere. It's about as different from modular as it's possible to be, and it's fraught with risk. The other dimension of this question that I wanted to say something about has to do with the relative cost effectiveness of nuclear as a response to climate change. And here again, there are more cost-effective options that can actually get us results in the 2020s when we need them if we're going to bend the curve of greenhouse gas emissions. There is a global energy transition underway. An expanding nuclear power in Ontario runs counter to the direction of that transition, and it would divert capital and human resources from the investments that we need to be making to avoid falling further behind in the ability to produce the products and services that will underpin the 21st century economy. This is a losing strategy, doubling down on nuclear. And notwithstanding the priority that's been given to cost cutting in the design of the new reactor at Darlington, and I have to say, when you read the design documents, the repeated emphasis on cost cutting is by itself somewhat worrisome. The capital costs for nuclear would have to have continued to increase, as Ramana showed, while the costs of the alternatives have been falling at historically unprecedented rates for efficiency and for renewable energy and for storage technologies. And we work on these technologies very intensively at corporate nights. And I can tell you that the solutions for our climate problem and for achieving a sustainable energy transition are growing very, very fast. Here you see growth rates for solar, electric cars, residential heat pumps, battery storage additions. These are very, very steep exponential growth curves that are projected by the International Energy Agency to continue throughout the 2030s. These are the cost reductions, some of the cost reductions that we were referring to earlier. These are, if you look at this right-hand side, these are incredibly steep reductions in costs that we've been seeing for batteries and solar and wind at a time when the cost for nuclear power has actually been going up. It's the only energy technology in history, actually, nuclear, which has got a long-term pattern of increasing unit cost over time. Oil, gas, coal, solar, wind, all of the others have a long-term trend to lower costs. And this, very briefly, gives you a sense of the momentum of this transition that I was referring to a moment ago. The top line tracks companies. We do this at corporate nights. The top line is tracking the companies that score the highest in our measure of sustainable production. So there's no fossil fuel production in that green line. There's no nuclear in that green line. We do have the electric vehicles and the solar and the wind and the green buildings in that line. That green line represents the growth of the companies that are making those things. The nuclear and the oil and the gas and the rest of the world economy on average is represented by the blue line. This is the train that you want to be on. The future of the energy transition in this world is heading in a direction, it's a very exciting direction that offers the promise of a sustainable energy system, which will be more distributed, which will run on renewable energy, and I think which will be much more compatible with the values that we all hold dear here in Canada. Finally, my last piece of advice would be keep calm, use energy efficiently, and build the new grid. We've got some time here in Ontario. Electricity consumption is down this year over last year. It's down 12% compared to 20 years ago, in spite of growth of population and economy. Electrification of heat and transport will be necessary to respond to climate change, but if you couple it in a clever way with efficiency, we can keep electricity consumption growth to low levels. Very low levels, well below 1%, I think possibly as low as 0.5%. So there's no cause for panic. We've got the time to get this right. Our goal should be to electrify while holding total electricity consumption to under 1% per year. And there's no way that you would come to the conclusion that nuclear would be a good choice in the context of this transition or the other possibilities that are facing us in Ontario for our energy future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. That was an amazing presentation. We've got a lot of questions in the Q&A. So I think I'm going to start by just asking some of the more clarifying questions first, and then we will move on. So maybe if all of the presenters want to come back, I think, Mark, I'm going to start with you. We have been asked, or you specifically, one of your slides mentions that there's a $7 billion annual electricity rate subsidy. And could you please elaborate on this? Do other jurisdictions subsidize electricity rates?
Yes, thanks, Laura. This is essentially a vestige of the Fair Hydro plan that the Wind government adopted to reduce electricity rates by 25%, essentially overnight, and effectively transferred a portion of electricity costs, particularly capital costs. Well, initially it was actually being added to the debt of Ontario Power Generation, and the Conservatives then effectively transferred it to general revenues. So this is effectively related to capital costs of investments in the system. That is to say, is coming straight out of general revenues. That is equivalent to the pre-COVID provincial deficit. So that's money that would otherwise be going on healthcare, education, other things. Subsidization on this scale out of general revenues is not normal. It violates every principle there is around the economics of energy and electricity systems, inherently inefficient and a misallocation of resources. What the province could have done and should have done, because of course we were in a period of significant rate increases in the 2010s, driven principally by the refurbishment projects of the nuclear fleet, would have been to have much more targeted relief at the rural and low income and more marginalized consumers who really were suffering very badly, as opposed to an across the board rate reduction. So that's where that's coming from. And the current projection is for that essentially to continue virtually indefinitely. I mean, some of the capital costs are being paid down, but they were extended well out into the 2040s in some cases. So that's what's going on there. But the basic answer is this is not normal. The basic principle is that the system should be paying for itself, and that it should not have to be being subsidized out of general revenue. And if you're having to do that, that is a signal that something is seriously, seriously wrong.
Thanks for that. I believe that was only slide specific clarification, but maybe I'll open this up sort of as a broad question, if any, see who wants to answer, and then we'll go into some panelist specific questions. But there's a question about a report by Ministers Guilbeault and Wilkinson from the report Powering Canada Forward, building a clean, affordable, and reliable electricity system for every region of Canada. And the target is net zero electricity by 2035, and the plan to get there is by nuclear. So is it possible to achieve a goal of net zero electricity by 2035 if nuclear is not an option?
Rita? It depends on what you mean. I mean, the focus there is principally on additional new nuclear, as opposed to what exists. And certainly, I mean, Ontario is by far the most nuclear dependent province. It's really only us in New Brunswick who have reactors. Reactors, New Brunswick has one facility. Certainly, it's feasible without new build. Indeed, it will essentially we have to be essential, because it's for the reasons we've discussed. You're not going to have new build by the mid 2030s of any significant scale. I would point in particular to the modeling that was done by Power Advisory for the Atmospheric Fund that looked at these questions very specifically in an Ontario context, and emphasized the importance, as Ralph was hinting at already, on the conservation demand management side in managing these transitions. The Suzuki Foundation's sort of longer term projections towards net zero are similar. I mean, both assume that the Darlington and Bruce refurbishments, which are pretty committed, would probably happen and then continue out to the end of their service lives. At this stage, the costs are very sunk. But the short answer is yes, certainly not without the need for any new nuclear construction. Given the range of options we have on the demand side, too, is keeping in mind, most provinces do not have any effective demand side strategies in place. BC is an exception. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia a bit because they have utilities. I was involved with DEC in Quebec, but even there, that's sort of winding down. So the potential there is enormous. The renewables potential is enormous. So I think the short answer is yeah, we can do this. We don't need to go there.
That is a great answer. And Ramana, did you want to add on?
Yeah, I just add that, I mean, I entirely agree with what Mark said, but I think there's a real risk that provinces and the federal government will go ahead with some new nuclear construction by taking the marketing materials that all these companies are producing, which say things like we can construct this in 4 years and things of that sort, and at a very sort of underestimated price. And they might embark on these projects which won't get completed, but because that's happening, other projects won't go on, and so we will not meet those things. And this is actually happening in New Brunswick, because they kept saying that they're going to shut down their coal plant based on new nuclear plants, and now it's clear that neither the ARC nor the Maltex design are going to be ready, and so they're now talking about what are we going to do with the coal plant. And so that, I think, is the real dilemma.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to understate, slide I didn't get to, I wouldn't want to understate the current federal government's enthusiasm for nuclear, which is quite stunning, and has completely ignored the kind of issues that Ralph was raising in terms of sustainability. I mean, there's the $1 billion for Darlington. There's more in the budget. The expectation is a large amount of the clean electricity tax credit will actually go for nuclear. I expect we would see more investments from the infrastructure bank if New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, Alberta were to try and move ahead. This is the question: who's going to finance this? The answer is you and I, as our capacities as federal taxpayers, is who's going to finance this, because the private capital isn't interested. And that's what we saw with the earlier nuclear renaissance, where the Obama administration in the United States shoveled, enormous amounts of money in the direction, and we ended up with 2 reactors in the end, because it simply is non-economic. But I think big questions need to be being put to the federal government about what it thinks it's doing here, and where it thinks it's going. I mean, I find the support for Moltex just shocking in light of the weapons proliferation issues that are being, serious questions being raised about whether that puts us into violation of the non-proliferation treaty. And they won't even conduct an assessment of it under the Impact Assessment Act. So I think there's a lot of questions out there about the federal level.
And I think that's a good leeway. I was, Ramana, in one of your slides about in Ohio, but also Ralph, you sort of talked about like the geopolitical aspects that aren't often talked about or covered. And so, presumably there are economists working for the government. And I wonder where the persuasion comes for this type of investment, given even if the only information given to them was these presentations here today. So I don't know if Ralph or Ramana, you want to maybe speak if there are some underlying persuasions that are less transparent about where some of this investment initiatives come from the government in terms of new nuclear infrastructures.
Well, you can address a question like that on so many levels. I've been asking that question for 45 years now, and I have had a lot of interaction from time to time, not so much in recent years, with enthusiasts of the nuclear option. And on one level, it's a very emotional and to a certain extent irrational base of support. And it always has been with nuclear power. And it's kind of ironic because it was a card that was often played by the industry's communications to suggest that those who opposed nuclear energy were coming from an emotional or an irrational perspective, when it's really the opposite that's been the case. I think it probably goes all the way back to the origins of this technology in the atomic bombs in Japan, and the desperate effort to assuage the guilt, I think, that probably came in the wake of that. The program called Atoms for Peace, can we swords into plowshares? Those were the kinds of slogans that characterized the early days when there was a very, very strong cadre of scientists and engineers that had been involved in the weapons project that were dedicating themselves to try and rescue something good out of this horrific power that they had unleashed. So that's one way that you can attack that question that you've posed. Another dimension is that there has just been decade after decade of large financial and institutional investment in this technology. It got wrapped up in Canadian nationalism, another somewhat irrational and emotional element of the support for this option. So there's a lot of factors at work. We could go on about this that tend to result in irrational and illogical choices being made among those who are directing the public support at this technology. The reason why the people who are trying to urge them to provide that support are doing so are much more obvious. It's the industry that stands to benefit financially from increased government investment in what they do and so on. But the question of why generation after generation of bureaucrats, and particularly federal bureaucrats, have so energetically and enthusiastically embrace this technology in the face of clearly irrational or in the face of clear rational arguments for why it was time to stop doing that, I think you really are getting into an area of mass psychology.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you for that. There's
Laura, can I add something to that?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, we can also look at this from a different, not focused on nuclear perspective, which is to think about how some of these decisions are being made. First, I'd say that, like Mark said, the federal government seems to be very committed to nuclear power. And to some extent, the same thing is true down south under the Biden administration. And part of their problem, I think, is that they want to be seen as supporting all of the above. So they give a little bit of money to carbon capture and storage and to hydrogen and even nuclear fusion and everything under the sun. Basically, if you just say, I have a climate solution, you'll get some money. And that's, I think, part of the problem. And the second thing is, I think, when you think about some of these economists and these modelers, and this is also true at a global level, people who look at these integrated assessment models, they are being told essentially that you have to find a model that will actually result in reductions and meet 1.5 degrees Celsius or whatever it is, but keep everything else as it is. So, economic growth has to be continuing, et cetera, et cetera. And so then they basically say, we have to make a bunch of assumptions, which we know, they may even know that these are unrealistic assumptions. But if they put in realistic assumptions for nuclear or for hydrogen or for any of these things, they will never meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And so they have to come out with a positive message. And I think that's the other constraint other dynamic that we are seeing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for that. The chat is full of questions about alternatives, which I will say, as somebody in this sphere myself, one of the questions particularly was after your presentation, Ralph, about, does this mean that we're going to go back to like just relying on gas? Whereas I'm often asked, like, if nuclear isn't a part of our energy equation, we're going to go back to coal. I know that everybody talked about alternatives, and Ralph specifically about solutions in your presentations, but can we get a little bit more into that about what some other alternatives could be if we're going to phase out nuclear and still achieve a climate forward pathway?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to just point out that the focus of tonight's conversation was whether new nuclear investment was a good idea for Ontario. The challenge of phasing out the existing nuclear is much more, it's a different question. It's a more difficult one given the high level of dependence that has built up in this province for nuclear as part of our electricity supply. And it has not been studied in any detail. The only phase out scenario that I have ever seen for Ontario was one that I did, and that was like 20 years ago, and it's completely irrelevant given the advances that have been made in solar and wind and efficiency and conservation technologies and heat pumps and all the rest. So we're long overdue for and you would think that if for no other reason to have a contingency plan in the event that it for some reason became necessary to close down the nuclear plants, that there would have been more work done on this than there has been. But we do not have, as far as I know, a articulated pathway for the phasing out of nuclear power in Ontario, and we should have one. At the margin, however, avoiding new nuclear is a walk in the park, frankly. I mean, we just don't need to go there. Between the conservation and efficiency options that are available to us, between the tremendous efficiency gains that electrification itself brings, including to end uses like baseboard heating, where it reduces electricity use by a factor of 2 or 3 and reduces peak. We have a lot of options for leaning into the electrification of heat pumps and transportation before it would have to trigger a decision to build large new capacity in this province. And in the Canadian context, we're sitting next door to Quebec, which has a surplus of carbon-free electricity, which could increase that surplus by tens of terawatt hours a year if it would also pursue the efficiency and conservation resource that is sitting in its buildings in the form of inefficient baseboard heating that could be converted to heat pumps. So we have enormous solar and wind resources in this province. I mean, Canada is blessed in the sense that we have a lot of land for the number of people here, and the sun shines on all of it, and the wind blows across all of it more than we would like some days. So we are in a good position in this country to show the world really how an advanced industrial society can complete the transition to a sustainable energy system and do it in a way that would involve no new investment in nuclear, and over the longer term. And as I say, the study needs to be done to say how long that longer term would have to be, phasing out the dependence that Ontario, and it's really the only province in New Brunswick to a certain extent, Quebec has already turned its back on the nuclear option. So it's not like this is rooted across the country in a deep way, but here in Ontario, it's very deeply rooted. The dependence is very high, and it's a big question that's worthy of a lot more analysis than it's been given as to how we could phase out our existing dependence. There are countries, I mean, there are lots of countries in the world that have lifestyles equal or higher than ours, that have figured out a way to do it without relying on nuclear power. So it's not like it hasn't been done in other places.
I just point out the Suzuki Foundation's modeling that they did out to net zero for 2050 does in fact include a ramp down of the existing nuclear fleet in Ontario. So they did actually model out what that might look like. And they did it using very, very sophisticated models. Folks at UVic did the actual modeling. And probably were underestimating the potential on the demand side when they did that. So the process of beginning to think about what that looks like has actually started in some serious way. Most of the other modeling has been focused, looking at 2035 to begin with, and certainly, the case, as Ralph says, the case to there for a new build, either on the gas side or the nuclear side, is very weak. The IESO, among other things, did a study on distributed resources. I don't know how it ever saw the light of day, but it did. Which basically said, well, we don't need any additional capacity given the DER potential out to the 2030s. So we're in no shortage of options, and have begun to think about what this looks like in the longer term. And it is the nuclear piece really isn't, as Ralph says, it's an Ontario problem. Nobody else in Canada is anywhere near as dependent on the scale that we are. I mean, we are the hard case. Alberta and Saskatchewan will face other challenges, but there are other pathways for them as well.
Anything that you'd like to add on that, Ramana, or I can?
No, I think we have plenty of questions in the chat. So
yeah.
There's a lot of questions in the chat also that have to do with waste. Some of them about, returning waste back to the mines where they came from and the sort of safety of transportation, but also about the ability to use waste as it's dumped into the Great Lakes, for example, and the warming of the lakes, and if there's an ability to produce energy from waste. And if somebody feels comfortable speaking to that, maybe Ramana.
Yeah, I'll start with the question of radioactive waste. And I also noticed there was a question about whether the waste can be used as fuel in reactors. And I bring that up because this is a big selling point in New Brunswick with Moltex and claiming that they're going to be able to use that. But I want to sort of go back to one of my slides where I talked about the fact that the same design can never meet all of these constraints. So if you want to go to a design that tries to use nuclear waste, then what that means is you're going to use reactors that operate in what we call the fast spectrum, which is with neutrons which are not slowed down. And just sort of back up, you cannot use nuclear waste to produce energy. What you can use is just the plutonium isotopes that are being produced, and maybe some of the transuranics, which is only a very, one or two elements there. There's a large number of radioactive elements that are produced in nuclear plants that simply cannot be used for fission reactions. And so those things have to be dealt with. But even those, the ones that use the plutonium and so on, if you're using in the fast spectrum, you necessarily are going to have a much higher concentration of fissile material in the core, which means it's more proliferation risky. It also increases certain kinds of accident risks, in particular what we call core disassembly accidents. And so there are always going to be trade-offs and consequences for making those choices. So in that sense, using waste will also make it more expensive. And already, as I said, nuclear power has an economic problem. So I'll just say that. And then lastly, about the question of waste heat. In principle, yes, you can use waste heat in some ways, but often there is a cost associated with trying to convert that heat into some useful energy. For example, if you want to use it to heat homes or something of that sort, you'll have to build pipelines and water that sort of circulates around, and it depends on how close you are to the reactor. And you don't want to live very close to the reactor because of the risk of meltdowns and reactor accidents. So you don't want to have large communities of people living nearby. And so that's a constraint. So.
Yeah, I would add, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which was set up by the federal government to deal with the waste fuel, actually ruled out reprocessing very early on, for the reason Ramana says, the weapons proliferation risks, but also in some ways the waste you end up with from reprocessing are even more difficult to manage. They're likely to be liquids, which are basically impossible to contain. Over the timescales we're talking, which is 1 million years. And they will sort of open the door a little bit, but if you read their documents, they're still very, very cautious. And I think very tough. They should be asking a lot more questions about the nature of the waste that would come from Moltex, for example, in New Brunswick, but also from these other reactor designs. The whole thing was not that they have anywhere to put the waste, but the whole thing was premised that they would just be dealing with waste from CANDUs. And if Ontario does what it says it's going to do, then we're not dealing with CANDU waste anymore. And the whole set of cascading questions that should be coming out of that I'm not hearing from NWMO. And I think we should be.
Agreed. Ralph, did you want to add to that? Or sorry if I thought you unmuted, but so there's a question here that talks about the Clean Air Alliance advocating for purchasing hydro from Quebec, and another that talks about why aren't we buying hydro from Quebec? So if Quebec sells so much of its power, why are we not utilizing, power that already exists at a surplus within Canada, then doing something that seems economically not feasible and also creates such a burden of waste?
On this way, I hate to plug the book, but there is a fabulous chapter by my friends and colleagues Pierre-Olivier Pinault and Joanne Whitmore at HEC at Université de Montréal, specifically on the situation in Quebec. This is getting slightly more complicated, that Ontario is at risk that it missed the initial opportunity with Quebec. And we may recall Monsieur Legault was begging Doug Ford to take the surpluses off his hands. And Doug Ford absolutely refused to listen. The situation in Quebec is getting somewhat more complicated in terms of there may or may not be utilization in the future for the surpluses that existed. But then on the other hand, as Ralph says, and Pierre-Olivier has said, and others have pointed out, the energy efficiency potential in Quebec is enormous. Because of the reliance of very inefficient electric space heating and other factors as well. So it would be slightly more complicated, but not that difficult to put Quebec into a clear surplus situation again. And then, yes, there's an absolute logic to partnering with them, especially if we anticipate growth in intermittent renewables, because Quebec's system also has this enormous storage capacity. It's an ideal partner if you've got a large portion of variable renewable energy. And Quebec can store a year's worth of electricity supply behind the dams. So very, very well positioned. There's similar conversations also, seeing as we seem to be stuck with Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland. There are discussions too about an Atlantic loop in Atlantic Canada to make use of that resource as a way of facilitating higher renewables penetration there as well. So it is the landscape of Quebec. We missed the easy boat with Quebec. Monsieur Legault begged, we said no. That window might not be quite the way where it was before, but there are other opportunities around Quebec which we could make very, very good use of.
So great answer. Also, Muskrat Falls plug. I appreciate that.
It was a bad idea, but we're stuck with it.
Stuck with.
See, there is also in the book an excellent chapter from a team in Atlantic Canada who talked about that in considerable depth. Not that I mean to be plugging too much, but we're a few weeks from publication, and we do have chapters on these very themes.
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading that book, I will say. So on that topic, just of like Quebec storing so much energy, there's also some questions in here about hydrogen and the storage of like hydrogen storage for energy. Is anybody, I know that that's sort of, it's an alternative, but I don't know if anybody's prepared to sort of talk about that hydrogen generation as a strategy for energy storage and distribution. I know there's some activities sort of going on in the Great Lakes area. Can anybody speak to that?
I can if you want. The general answer is my standard answer, and again, there are research groups who are working more specifically on hydrogen. Generally, the energy balance for what's called power to gas, so using electricity to make hydrogen for another purpose, are very bad. You put in a lot of energy to make the hydrogen, store it, handle it. The general consensus seems to be you're better off doing direct electrification where you can and skipping the conversion stages of turning it into gas. There may be particular applications for hydrogen, particularly in things that you can't electrify. And the classic examples that have come up have been steel, particularly high quality steel. Cement is another. Certain chemical production processes are another, where the production process is tied up with the physics and chemistry of what you're doing. So there may be roles there. I mean, theoretically, Ontario and Canada have put $1 billion into Dofasco and Algoma to move them to a hydrogen-based process. So maybe there are some applications, but on the other hand, the Federal Environmental Commissioner said that overall the role of hydrogen is probably being overstated. So that's kind of where we are. I mean, the big backers of hydrogen, I'm afraid, are the natural gas industry, who see it as their future, but only if you combine it with carbon capture storage. And then the other folks who have talked a lot about this are the nuclear folks, because they would think they're going to provide electricity for electrolysis. So it's a complicated one, but I think it's worth looking into. It's one that requires another higher level of scrutiny than it's getting in terms of where does it fit. I mean, it probably has a role, in a transition, but it may not be as large as some of its backers seem to think it's likely to be.
Thank you for that. Couple questions in there about that. So I think that that's really helpful. I think I'm going to start wrapping it up here. I think we've had a really, really great discussion tonight, but I want to ask one more question, maybe each, if that's okay. Ramana, because you sort of, in your intro, I sort of talked about a new book that you have coming out, which we're all really eager to read. So, you know, in a nutshell, not that this is a complex question or anything, but can you tell us why nuclear power is not a solution to climate change?
Thank you, Laura. Very happy with that question. I'm also looking forward to reading my book. I've been working on it for a long time. It's just not getting written fast enough. But in a nutshell, as you said, I think there are three kinds of arguments I make about in my book. One is there are a set of properties of nuclear energy which are not desirable. We've talked about the risk of accidents. We've talked about the generation of radioactive waste that stays hazardous for a very long period of time, and the linkage with nuclear weapons. Now, there are some people who would say the climate emergency is so grave that we need to overlook these problems. And we can have that argument, but that's one set of reasons. The second are a set of reasons which I would say are about the feasibility of nuclear energy. And that has to do with the high cost and the time. That's actually what I presented in this thing. So if I could have ended that by saying, for these reasons, I don't think we should be building nuclear power. But there's a third set of reasons also, which I think we've sort of talked about a little bit during the Q&A, which has to do with the political economy of nuclear energy. Who are the people who are building these plants? Who are the people who profit from them? And what is the sort of underlying set of reasons that people are using to advance nuclear energy, right? And so if you look at many places, for example, the United States is a great example simply because they have all these different states which have different properties, different rules. You find there's a strong overlap between the utilities that own nuclear plants and that have large fossil fuel interests. And this is to be expected because a nuclear plant is so expensive. You have to be a large utility, and you're not going to be a large utility only having nuclear plants. And so for those utilities, they don't have a strong interest in reducing their emissions fast and meeting climate targets. And then there are a whole bunch of people, the Bill Gates of the world, if you like, or Sam Altman or somebody like that, who would like to build nuclear plants because they are sort of these techno ultra optimists, if you like, and also see technology as the solution to everything, and because they just like the way the world is and they benefit enormously, and they just would like to sort of replace it with some magic technology, leave everything else the same. And I don't think that's ever going to work out. So these are sort of the reasons I have.
That was a nutshell, and thank you so much for that. I think that's an excellent answer, and maybe I'll be using that in my future. That also sort of touched on a question that I had for you, Mark, which you alluded to it. Okay, maybe you talked about it and you just didn't use these specific words. But regulatory capture, big buzzword in the nuclear industry, I think beyond Canada, but certainly within Canada. So I wondered if in a nutshell, just as we wind down here, if you could tell us a little bit about maybe how that holds so true for Canada, and where the lack of transparency comes in for the people who are paying for nuclear investments, which is us, and if there is any pathway forward that could make a more transparent system.
That's an easy question, right? Well, the problem, of course, is the actual nuclear regulator, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, is the poster child for regulatory capture. Indeed, I'm a contributor to a volume that one of our adjunct professors, Bruce Campbell, put together on. It's called Corporate Rules from Lorimer. I didn't intend to be plugging so many books here, but this is what we're doing. It's essentially about regulatory capture in Canada. Of course, the lead substantive chapter is about nuclear regulation in Canada. you have a regulator who turns up as a cheerleader effectively for the industry. It's very difficult to take them seriously as a regulator in that context. So clearly, breaking the revolving door relationships with the industry are crucial. But also keeping in mind that CNSC is not an economic regulator or an environmental regulator, so it refuses to look at the questions about whether in economic terms or environmental terms or climate change terms, these projects make any sense. And part of the situation we've ended up in Ontario is we have no forum at all for asking those kinds of questions in a serious way, which is precisely what the industry is taking advantage of, is the fact that you can't ask those questions, because every time in Ontario those kinds of questions have been asked, be it on the Royal Commission on Electric Power System Planning that Ralph was part of in the 70s and 80s, the Ontario Hydro Demand Supply Plan review in the 1990s, and indeed the Integrated Power System Plan review in the early 2000s, the case falls apart. It has not survived the encounter with evidence. And so that's part of the window that the industry is looking to exploit in Ontario especially, and Canada more generally, is that they found a very weak regulatory environment, both on the safety side, but also on the economic and environmental side, and are looking to combined with governments that are not particularly noted for asking critical questions, and they're looking to lock in before anybody can really realize what's going on and what the implications are in the longer term.
That was record timing for a question of that complexity. Thank you so much. And I guess last question for the night. Ralph, unless there's something else you'd like to speak to, I'd like to ask you, there's sort of a lot of folks sort of talk about reutilizing the brownfields of nuclear as, sites where reactors currently exist are invariably useless for anything else after they house old reactors or other radioactive wastes. So would this be a valid enough reason for modernizing current reactors, or for, adding new reactors in this type of space? Or what do you think about that? You're on mute there, sorry.
I think that it just delays the inevitable. I mean, these sites are eventually going to have to be rehabilitated or made safe, even with the life extensions and so on. In the longer scheme of things, these sites are going to have to be reclaimed in some way. It's interesting, and the Clean Air Alliance did some work on this a couple of years ago. The dismantling and decommissioning of old nuclear power plants is actually a very fast-growing industry. There are, as again, referring to Michael Snyder's excellent World Nuclear Industry Review that comes out every year, there's more plants being shut down than there are being built. And they all are going to have to be defueled, taken apart, cleaned up. The waste is going to have to be disposed of. There's no alternative but to do that cleanup. So there's actually an opportunity there for those countries that figure out how to do this, because the global demand is going to be huge. Whether or not, I mean, obviously the approach here in Ontario has been to use the existing sites for new reactors, in spite of the fact that increases the some types of vulnerability and lack of resilience that we were talking about earlier, because the prospect of putting a new site through an environmental assessment, which would be unavoidable, I think, is just one that they don't even want to contemplate. And so the Bruce site, for example, if 4 more large 1,000 megawatt reactors were to be built on that site, would become far and away the largest concentration of nuclear power on any one site in the world. There's nothing good about that kind of concentration from a security point of view, from a resilience point of view, from a diversity and reliability point of view. It's really stupid, actually. So I can't say that. I guess I'm wandering around inside your question, whether it makes sense to use.
Oh, somehow I'm muted there.
Ralph, you're muted.
Sorry. I think just to close, though, there's a bigger picture here, which we always have to keep in mind when we're asking these more narrowly focused questions, which is whether or not we are going to get serious in Ontario and in this country, for that matter, about making this transition to sustainability, which so many other parts of the world are well on their way to addressing now and are ahead of us. Nuclear power is sort of a throwback option in that outlook. When you look at where the momentum is in the energy economy of the world, where the excitement is, where the young engineers are most excited about working, where the venture capital is most excited about investing, it's in the new energy system that's emerging that is based on renewable sources, on storage, on clever, efficient buildings, on smart buildings, on electrification, on and underpinning all of that. And just to give a nod to comments made in the question field from Tony McQuell this evening, underpinning all of that, we also have to come to terms with this growth mentality, which continues to drive all of our economic and public policies, that we can somehow continue to increase consumption and increase growth as if there were no planetary limits that will be transgressed if we do that. We haven't really talked about that here this evening. This has been largely a technological and policy-focused, energy policy-focused type conversation. But there's a big, big challenge facing us and facing humanity in general. It's the big challenge of this century. Are we going to find a way to start living within the planetary limits? And any question, whether it's the role of nuclear power in Ontario, whether it makes sense to use this site for more reactors or to not build more reactors, must always be addressed in the context of how are we going to finally bring our technology and our economies and our way of living back within the boundaries of the planetary limits of this place where we live. Because if we don't do that, we're just bequeathing to our children and our grandchildren a world of hurt, a world of expense, and a world of sort of an increasingly difficult environment in which to try and build a prosperous and healthy future.
Thank you so much for that answer. That's food for thought. That's something I think that's a great way to end off. So thank you so much to all panelists for this evening. And thank you to the Ontario Clean Air Alliance for hosting such a wonderful event. I'm really thrilled and honored to have been able to moderate and to learn so much from all of you today, but also, long before just today. So I'm really appreciative for your time and energy and expertise. And thank you so much for tonight.
Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for your great moderation, Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Laura.
Thanks from Mark and Ralph I learned a lot from what you had to say.
As did I, from everyone.
Good night.
Good night.